The following special episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you without commercial interruption by our Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg so you can help support the show and keep it going and growing. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and help us help you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance. Now, on with the show.
So everything I say from now on is recorded?
From right now.
Okay.
3 seconds ago.
Okay.
Share.
Quit talking about you, Matt.
Well, that's... They're building a new... You can say something.
Okay. Well, Matt is recording everything I say, so this is my service announcement.
What did we miss? What facts about Joe Johnson?
Oh, is this for the podcast?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So he will listen to this again later and laugh so he had me on for a second time.
Taping?
Yeah, he is right now. It's recording right now. This is my warning before you say anything.
Oh, okay. Two-party consent?
Yes.
Okay.
But is he filming? Or is
I
it
don't
just...
know. I think it's just audio.
Audio? Oh, okay. You were on earlier...
I've been on twice, but the second time he asked me to talk about remembering.
Oh, okay.
And so he asked what chapter, and picked a chapter.
Yeah.
And then when we got there to do it, he starts talking. First he said the subtitle. I was like, that's not my book.
That's
So he
great.
read the wrong book. It was fun, though.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Carrie's going to speak to us about John Mosby. It's her new book project. I'm really excited to hear her early thoughts on this subject matter. Carrie, Janney.
Did let you win.
So, Pete, that's what we should have done. We should have recreated that on this stage. I don't know if it was more fun or more stress-inducing to work with Pete for an entire year on a project. No, truly, it was so much fun, and it's worth it just for the comedic relief to check out that program. So, how many of you know about John Mosby, by show of hands? Okay, it's a good start. How many of you have read his memoir? Okay, how many of you have seen the silent movie he was in? Ooh, okay, here we go. Now we're getting to something new. In 1910, he was a silent film star in All's Fair and Love and War. Now, to be fair, I can't find any clips of this, simply an advertisement. So if anyone finds any clips of this somewhere, please do let me know. Mosby, it turns out, was not only a movie star. In the 1890s, there were rumors that he would run for president. And cartoons such as this, with him shaking hands with McKinley before the '96 election, if you can see underneath, there's a bit of a glare, but it says General Mosby. And I should point out that this is something that was quite common. People often thought that he was of a higher rank than he was. He was only ever a colonel. But over the course of his life, John Mosby became a man simultaneously admired and loathed. From 1863 until his death in 1916, he captured the attention of the nation, alternately as a Confederate partisan, as a Southern Republican, a diplomat, a bureaucratic reformer, an orator, an author, and yes, even a film star. He sparred with other former Confederates such as Jubal Early and James Longstreet over the causes and fighting of the war. But he also enjoyed friendships with former Union officers, including Presidents Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and William McKinley. He dined with U.S. senators and tycoons, with British colonial governors, with literary figures such as Thomas Nelson Page. He was a friend of Theodore Roosevelt and members of the extraordinarily wealthy Astor family, including Lady Astor. I kind of had a throwaway line that I thought I would end up keeping, and that is, he's the Forrest Gump of the 19th century. He was absolutely everywhere, and he seemed to know everyone. Now, he's best remembered today as the leader of one of the Confederacy's most successful and, yes, infamous partisan units, the 43rd Virginia Battalion, better known as Mosby's Rangers. But such a narrow focus, I think, obscures what makes him truly interesting, or at least interesting to me. And Pete asked me to talk, so I'm going to talk about what's interesting to me. Today I'm going to focus on two reasons beyond his Civil War service that made Mosby important. First and foremost, Mosby was so much more than a Confederate partisan. He was indeed a man of the 19th century. His life stretched from 1833 to 1916, so 76 years on either side of the war. And in those years, he witnessed and engaged in some of the century's most important currents, changing ideas about race and gender, civil service reform, immigration, especially when it had to do with Chinese immigration, railroad monopolies, homesteading and ranching, indigenous land titles, and even the dangers of college football. Now, I won't be able to touch on all of these or even a fraction of these today, but I want to point out that his life showcases the transformations in the United States between the 1830s and the 1910s. Second, Mosby served as an alternative path for Confederate veterans and former slaveholders, in that he absolutely rejected the lost cause ideology and the pageantry that might have enshrined him in Virginia and across the South. Key to this was that he refused to deny that slavery had been the cause of the war. So what I want to do for the next bit is give you an overview of Mosby's life with just a passing glance at his Civil War service, and think about how he is embodying all of these transformations that are taking place. I often like to think about the fact that we're Civil War historians here. We're very interested in a period of primarily 4 years, but these people had lives both before and after the war. And what does it mean to have that as a background that is very pivotal, but shaping the rest of your life, and yet in some ways not shaping the rest of your life? So we'll of course start with Mosby's childhood. He's born at his maternal grandparents' plantation in Powhatan County, Virginia, December 6, 1833, to Alfred and Virginia Mosby. A few short weeks after his birth, his parents returned to their Nelson County home before a few short years later moving to a small plantation in Albemarle County just outside of Charlottesville, where his father was the owner of 21 enslaved people. One of the things that I've noticed that's incredibly striking and makes research both fun and challenging on Mosby is that he moves constantly throughout his life. There's a group of counties in central Virginia and in northern Virginia constantly moving around. But in 1850, 16-year-old Jack, as he was called by his family, enrolled in the University of Virginia, where he excelled in Greek language and literature, but struggled with mathematics, barely passing many of those courses. He gained a reputation in Charlottesville, though, as a troublemaker, defying local ordinances, riding through town at a gallop, participating in raucous parties, and getting into fistfights. But it was during his third year that the most infamous incident happened when a notorious campus bully by the name of George Turpin insulted him, and Mosby promptly shot him in the neck. The student survived, but a jury found Mosby guilty of unlawful shooting, which carried a sentence of 12 months in the county jail and a fine of $500. Perhaps the biggest blow for young Mosby came when he learned that the university had expelled him even before his trial began. Yet his time in that jail cell in downtown Charlottesville proved pivotal, because he befriended his prosecutor. This is a theme that we'll see over and over again, befriending people who in some ways should have been or were enemies at one point. Befriended the local prosecutor, and the 19-year-old began to read law in that jail cell in Charlottesville. Meanwhile, his mother and other well-positioned friends, family friends, lawyers in the community began a petition campaign to get him released from prison. He was a very frail child. He suffered constantly from illnesses. His mother, there's these wonderful letters that his mother writes to the governor of Virginia trying to get him released. And in fact, he is finally released in December of 1853 after serving 7 months. he's granted a pardon by the governor of Virginia. At 22, and another little interesting tidbit, when all of this happens in Charlottesville, the family decides, his parents decide that they need to move out of Albemarle County. And so they're going to head to Fluvanna County, which I've marked here. I can't quite get to the map well enough, but by the red line. They've moved to Fluvanna County where they're going to hunker down. They don't sell the home in Charlottesville right away, but soon enough, Mosby is going to join them. First, he is going to practice law in the small hamlet of Howardsville in Albemarle County before moving his practice to Fluvanna County. In December of '56, he would marry Kentucky native Pauline Clark, who was the daughter of a former Kentucky Democratic gubernatorial candidate and who would later be the U.S. minister to Guatemala and Honduras. The young couple would reside with Mosby's parents for the first 2 years of their marriage before moving to Washington County, down in the tip, the toe of Virginia, to Bristol along the Virginia-Tennessee border, where Mosby hung out his shingle as one of the first lawyers in the town. Within 2 years, they had welcomed the same number of children. During the 1860 election, Mosby would vocally support Stephen A. Douglas, the Northern Democrat, a Union Democrat, railing against those in town who had been supporting Breckinridge. And some of this will start to foreshadow his political opposition in the years to come. But like so many Virginians and other white Southerners, over the course of the secession winter, his allegiances began to shift. By March, he had been appointed as one of 3 members of a commission in Washington County to respond to Lincoln's inaugural address and explain why the county of Washington should support secession. So we often read that it's in April of '61 that Mosby would decide he's going to support the Confederacy, but in fact, he has already shifted his thinking immediately after Lincoln's inaugural address. In May of '61, he would enlist in the Confederate Army as a private in the Washington County Mounted Rifles, which reported to Richmond, where it became part of Jeb Stuart's 1st Virginia Cavalry. And by 1862, he was scouting for Stuart. This is another pivotal relationship for Mosby. His adoration and his devotion to Stuart would remain a constant for the rest of his life. He even named one of his daughters Stuart. But by 1863, the physically unassuming 29-year-old had risen to prominence as the commander of the 43rd, again, otherwise known as Mosby's Rangers. This was an elite partisan unit sanctioned by the Confederate government, sanctioned by Lee, and most of the Rangers were from the area around Fauquier, from Loudoun, from Fairfax, and Prince William counties. So those counties in Northern Virginia, some of you might know this area referred to as Mosby's Confederacy, where they engaged in independent service close to their homes. Their repeated raids on Union camps and supply lines in Northern Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, and even into Southern Maryland brought them much public acclaim, both north and south. And I'm not going to linger on this part of the story. I think much of this is well known, what he was doing during the war, but what might not be as familiar to you is his post-war life. Clinging to his tenacious devotion to the Confederacy, after Lee surrendered on April 9th at Appomattox, Mosby would refuse to do likewise. Instead, he would disband his Rangers on April 21st. Interestingly enough, I talk about this in Ends of War. The very next day, the vast majority of them, about 300 of them, march into Winchester where they will surrender themselves up. So they'll all be paroled en masse, even though he had never officially agreed to surrender them. And it wouldn't be until mid-June that Mosby himself would turn himself into Union authorities to receive a parole and go back home. But many of those who had fought against Mosby, those who had spent the better part of 2 years searching for him, refused to believe that in fact he had been paroled. When he shows up in Charlottesville in late June of 1865, the local provost marshal gets word that he's in town and doesn't believe that indeed anyone would ever have paroled Mosby. Part of this is because in the immediate wake of Appomattox, Grant has said that the terms of surrender should be applied to everyone who's willing to turn themselves in, except for Mosby. And so he's been a thorn in the side of the Union High Command. Does everybody else hear that? Is it me? It's a bird? It's a bird. Oh, okay. All right, just as long as it's not just in my head. Okay, so he is harassed in the summer of 65 because people don't believe that, in fact, he has been paroled. He shows up in Alexandria in August of 1865, and he's arrested by authorities because they don't think he should be showing himself in a loyal city such as Alexandria. He's released the next day. But in January of 66, he's arrested again, this time in Leesburg by a federal provost guard. He's not released immediately. Instead, it's going to be his wife, Pauline, who's going to go to Washington. She's going to request a meeting with Andrew Johnson, request that her husband be released. Well, Andrew Johnson refuses to see Pauline. And so she gets word that Grant is in the War Department offices. So she goes to Grant and she asks him if, in fact, he can do something to help her husband. Grant would order Mosby released, issue a new parole forbidding the provost marshals from interfering in Mosby with his practice of law. That's what's happened. He's gone back to Warrenton, Virginia. I think I skipped over that part. He's gone back to Warrenton, his old stomping ground, where he's going to practice law in Loudoun County and in Fauquier County. And every time he tries to travel around the circuit, he's being harassed, he's being arrested. And Grant says, no more of this. It's at this moment, even after Grant has been the one who said, Mosby is the one who can't be paroled, in April of 65, that he was one of the most wanted men in April and May of 65. Now, all of a sudden, in Mosby's mind, Grant is a hero. So this is going to be a turning point. But for those of you who know that Mosby becomes a Republican, it's important to point out that this is not the moment in which he becomes a Republican. In 1866, it's the moment that he will reflect on and talk about as being pivotal in his thinking about Grant. But Mosby is absolutely still a Democrat. He is still a conservative in politics. By 1866, he remains a popular figure in Virginia. His law practice in Warrenton was thriving. When he would travel anywhere, people would request his signature. He goes to New York, and people are asking for his photograph. They're asking for his signature. But in 1869, during Virginia's gubernatorial election, he would campaign for the Conservative, which was the name of the Democratic Party for all intents and purposes. He campaigns for the Conservative Party, and he lambasts the Republican Party for representing barbarism. He launched tirades against so-called carpetbaggers, calling them bounty jumpers and jailbirds. But in 1872, he had a decision to make. By 1870, Virginia had been readmitted to the Union, so there would be a presidential election that year in 1872. And the two candidates that are presented include Grant or the Democrat/liberal Republican candidate Horace Greeley. Mosby simply can't abide by voting for Greeley. And so the 38-year-old cast his lot with the former Union general, despite warnings from his close friends, and even from people like former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, that an alliance with Grant could irrevocably damage Mosby's reputation in the South. But Mosby insists that he is supporting Grant in order to protect the South, in order to reconcile the North and the South. And so during that election cycle, he's going to campaign for Grant throughout Virginia, constantly reminding people that his intentions were to unite Virginia conservatives with the Republican president. And he will say, I'm doing this for the good of Virginians. He says, I'm not doing this to foster, quote, Negro government and carpetbaggery. So he says he's doing this in the name of white reconciliation. Well, this doesn't bode well locally. I know this map is difficult to see, but Fauquier County decidedly goes for Greeley. And so the winds are starting to shift. Throughout Grant's second term, Mosby is going to work tirelessly for patronage positions for many of his former Rangers. People like William Chapman will get positions. But he's also being called on by people like Wilmer McLean from Appomattox to write to Grant, to go to Grant and get positions. He never gets a position for himself during this period. And indeed, in Virginia, he remains part of the Conservative Party. His support for Grant in 72 had not yet translated into an overall support for the Republican Party. Indeed, much of his aim appears to be in trying to convince conservatives to support the Republicans in order to exclude black men from political power in the South. So if I was working on going through newspapers, all of these wonderful newspaper databases that we have now, and Mosby is writing constantly to newspapers about political issues. It's simply almost too much to keep up with. It's voluminous. So he's constantly hashing out these political arguments in a very public forum. And as he explained in 1873, he had never identified himself with, quote, the radical organization in Virginia, which is composed almost entirely of carpetbaggers and Negroes. But in 1876, things had shifted so much that he finally cast his lot completely with the Republican Party, endorsing the next former Union general turned presidential nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes. And again, throughout the state of Virginia, he's campaigning on behalf of Hayes. When a Confederate veteran questioned his loyalty, Mosby fired back. I ceased to be a Confederate 11 years ago and became a citizen of the United States. I know very well the measure of denunciation which the expression of these sentiments will receive from the people in whose cause I shed my blood and sacrificed the prime of my life. Be it so. I wait on time for my vindication. Indeed, his political choices cost him dearly. Despite his insistence that he was working on behalf of the white South to make sure it had a place within the Union, in supporting Republican administrations, the celebrated guerrilla had incurred the wrath of many former Confederates. He became a persona non grata in his hometown of Warrenton. He lost clients. His income plummeted. Even his young children were subjected to taunts that their father was a Judas. And in 1876, after the birth of her 8th child, Pauline died. About 2 months later, the newborn baby would die as well. This left 43-year-old Mosby a widower with 6 children. And I should point out, one of the things that I find most compelling about Mosby is his devotion to the women in his life. He was a mama's boy. That's absolutely obvious. His mother was constantly protecting him and looking after him, but he was fiercely devoted to his wife, Pauline, and to their children, and in particular, very close relationships with his daughter. And he's absolutely distraught after the death of Pauline. Between her death and the circumstances that he's facing politically, he sells his home in Warrenton and moves to Washington, D.C., no longer welcome in the state in which he had defended. He would later write, quote, there was more vindictiveness shown to me by the Virginia people for my voting for Grant than the North showed me for fighting 4 years against them. But there's so much more to this story. It's not just his support of Grant. It's the way in which he leveled these political accusations. So amid the combined loss of Pauline, his increasing pariah status in Virginia, Mosby begins to wage a new war, this one with his pen. Now, as I've already mentioned, he had written countless newspaper articles about politics throughout the 1870s. But in December 1877, Mosby would pen his first public comments about the war in the pages of the Philadelphia Weekly Times. Always a rebel, his essay took aim at other Confederates, especially members of the so-called Lee cult, and his aim was to defend Stuart. Thus began one of the most important objects for the remainder of his life. Defending Stuart, especially when it came to the Gettysburg campaign, which went hand in hand with denouncing those who spouted the lost cause. Well, despite his ostracism, Mosby's support for the Republican Party had paid off, and in 1878, Hayes appointed him as a U.S. consul to Hong Kong. Leaving his 3 youngest children, the youngest of which was Ada, who was 7 years old at that point, but he had 3 children under the age of 12. He leaves them with his mother, Virginia, and he sails across the Pacific, where he would remain for the next 7 years, reaching the shores of Hong Kong. He is there in 1882 when the United States passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. Significant because all of the Chinese immigration to the United States in the 1870s and 1880s went through the port of Hong Kong. Indeed, in his reports, he noted in 1880 alone, some 7,304 Chinese immigrants had tried to make their way out of the port. He spent most of his time, however, and I mean immediately, he arrives in February of 1879, and within a week, he has started to wage a war of reform. Mosby goes from the guerrilla fighter to the reformer very quickly, fighting corruption amid the consular service, investigating those consuls who stole from sailors, who embezzled government funds, who pocketed fees from Chinese immigrants. And in particular, he took aim at Fred Seward. Fred Seward, who was the Assistant Secretary of State and none other than the son of Lincoln's former secretary. He accused Seward of protecting the so-called consular ring, all of those consuls that were in Shanghai and the surrounding area. Mosby, he's sending all of these, the documentation that he's sending back to the State Department, again, is voluminous. His handwriting is absolute scrawl. It's difficult to read. He's sending these massive reports, and they start writing back, the State Department starts writing back to Mosby and say, just fill out the forms that we send you. And in response, he writes this long legal brief about why he needs to actually write much more. And then, so every response back is, just fill out the forms that we send you. And so he has this antagonistic relationship with the clerks back in the State Department. Meantime, he is taking on the heavy hitters, such as Fred Seward and otherwise. In retaliation, one of his sisters, who had been hired for the Lighthouse Board, so part of that entry of women into the bureaucracy that starts to happen during the Civil War and picks up in the post-war era, one of his sisters is dismissed from her position. And he knows that he's being retaliated upon. Indeed, after the election of Democrat Grover Cleveland in 1884, he would lose his position as a consul, and he would spend years trying to get that position back. Again, his battles had cost him, this time his battles against corruption, and he's going to find it impossible to find another position. He returns to the U.S. in July of 1885, but he would not, and indeed he could not, return to Virginia. He knows this, so before departing Hong Kong, he had written to Grant asking for his assistance in finding another position. Now, as a consul, he claimed that he had managed to save little money. He still had 3 children under the age of 21 to support. And from his deathbed, Grant sent a telegram to Leland Stanford, a senator from California, and more importantly, the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, asking if he could perchance hire Mosby. When the 51-year-old former Confederate colonel stepped off the steamer in San Francisco, he learned that Grant had come to his aid one final time. He claimed that it would be the final letter that Grant ever wrote. I'm not sure that that's true, but indeed, Grant had helped him secure a position as an attorney for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And so Mosby is going to spend his time in San Francisco living. He never bought a home there. He lived in hotel rooms throughout his tenure in San Francisco. So he's working for one of the largest corporations in the United States at this time, again, an attorney for the Southern Pacific Railroad. That apparently wasn't enough to keep him busy because he decided he needed to keep writing. In the years between the end of the war and his return from Hong Kong, both Union and Confederate veterans had begun publishing their memoirs. Mosby had contemplated doing so since at least 1879, but he's first going to test the waters with a series of articles. And in July 1886, again while he's living in San Francisco, a literary agent approached him about penning a set of essays for the Boston Herald and the New York Sunday Mercury. And I want to point out again, these aren't Southern newspapers that are coming to him. Most of this is coming from New York and from New England. Perhaps it was the same agent who suggested that Mosby contact the George A. Jones and Company of Boston, which was a speaker firm, that he could perchance give a series of lectures, that maybe he could earn some money doing this. Whatever the connection, by the late summer of 1886, announcements had begun appearing in newspapers throughout New England advertising, quote, a limited number of lectures on the subject of Stuart's cavalry by Mosby. So his tour would not take him to the old battlegrounds of Virginia, nor would it take him to talk in front of Confederate veterans. Instead, on December 1st, 1886, he arrived in Boston, where the Union veterans of the John A. Andrew Post number 15 of the Grand Army of the Republic were the first to invite him to speak. He would speak at the historic Tremont Temple, and I'll give you one guess what his topic was about. Stuart's cavalry. It's all about Stuart's cavalry. It's really notable. He's not talking about his activities as commander of the 43rd. All of these first lectures are all about Stuart. A second wave of the tour would be underway the following spring, just as advanced sheets of his first book, which the full title was Mosby's War Reminiscences and Stuart's Cavalry Campaigns. So it begins rolling off the press in 1887. But neither this book nor his speaking tour proved very successful. There were lots of critics in the newspapers who said that he wasn't very funny, that he didn't deliver his addresses very well. I guess funny being what Pete seems to judge talks by. But this seemed to compel Mosby to continue his dual quest. So he has two things he's trying to do in his writings: defend Stuart and challenge the lost cause. He penned more pieces for the Century magazine, and it's here that he starts to expand his repertoire to include more on his partisan service, to include more about Grant. He starts talking about Grant being magnanimous at Appomattox, of course, leaving out conveniently the part about how Grant had said, "Don't parole Mosby." But his primary topic is always Stuart's cavalry at Gettysburg, or perhaps more specifically, not at Gettysburg. On this topic, he spars with James Longstreet. He accuses Henry Heath of publishing camp rumors that, quote, had their origin in the imagination of men who felt more interest in concealment than discovery of the truth. After publishing an article rebutting Charles Marshall's defensively at Gettysburg in 1896, Mosby observed, quote, "It looks like I shall be at war forever." But it was Jubal Early that particularly vexed him. Even after Early's death in 1894, Mosby minced no words, describing the self-proclaimed leader of the Lost Cause as, quote, "a most malignant enemy of mine." Indeed, he believed that leaders such as Early and George L. Christian, and a man he described as the Reverend Ass, J. William Jones, were responsible for keeping sectional tensions alive. It wasn't merely that Mosby had personal grievances with Early and Jones and others, or even that the debates were solely about Stuart. Mosby rejected the Lost Cause on ideological grounds. Unlike the great majority of former Confederates, even as a former slaveholder, he refused to disavow slavery as the principal cause of the war. In 1894, he observed, quote, "I always understood that we went to war on account of the thing we quarreled with the North about." And he's writing to a fellow Confederate veteran. "I never heard of any cause other of quarrel than slavery." 8 years later, his feelings remained the same. In the retrospect, slavery seems such a monstrous thing that some of us are now trying to prove that slavery was not the cause of the war. Then what was the cause? I always thought the South fought about the thing that it guarded. The Confederate soldiers were slaveholders. What did the 95% fight for? I answered that the 5% and the 95% all fought for the same thing. Mosby simply had no patience for those who chose to recast the war's cause as one as simply about states' rights. He would also write, quote, "Men fight from sentiment. After the fight is over, they invent some fanciful theory on which they imagine that they fought." So he's pointing out that the lost cause is a myth in the moment that it's being created. Equally as telling, he did not see the point in dotting the South with monuments to a failed rebel cause. Here he is again. If, as Confederate Cavalry General Thomas Rosser says, another Yankee army is coming down to destroy these monuments, I think we had better not raise any more. It is both a waste of money and time. He ought to get some credit for that. It's not only that he avoided dedications, he also avoided veteran reunions, and I should point out specifically Confederate veteran reunions. Even though his Rangers held reunions annually until 1926, he attended only one of those reunions at Alexandria in January of 1895. Now, his children would sometimes go. There's some images of his children attending the reunions, but he did not. So not only did he reject the lost cause mythologizing, he also enthusiastically and I think quite sincerely embraced reconciliation. He's not one of those reconciliationists that's just saying what he thinks needs to be said in the moment for political purposes. I think he truly believed in reconciliation. In other words, Mosby is a great reminder that the lost cause was a choice. It was not inevitable. And I think that's something that we need to really think about when we are evaluating some of these figures, Longstreet included. Well, even as he's waging his war against the lost cause, in 1901, he finally returned to his war against corruption. That year, President William McKinley, another Republican, another Union veteran, appointed him as a special agent in the Department of Interior's General Land Office, charged with enforcing fence laws in Nebraska. There had been a patent for barbed wire issued in 1874, and all of those public lands out west, they're now being fenced off by some of these, the huge cattle ranchers. And so he goes to war against the cattle barons. Anytime they would send out people to fence off land, he is reporting on it. He's writing more voluminous reports, this time to the Department of Interior, and getting called to the map for doing so once more. But he's going out and he's helping to cut down some of this barbed wire. It's not just that. He finds out that there are Union widows who are coming out to Nebraska and otherwise, and they are filing false homestead claims. Remember that 1862 Homestead Act had included Union veterans in the service, and the amount of years that you served got sliced off from the 5 years that you had to be an improvement on that land. Anyway, Union widows are coming out to file these homestead claims, and Mosby gets word of this and finds out that indeed they're filing them on behalf of some of the largest cattle ranchers in the area, and that they're fraudulent. So he turns them in, and hundreds of Union widows are indeed indicted for fraud. So, it's no mercy here. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're being corrupt, he's going to take care of you. When things get hot enough in Nebraska, President Theodore Roosevelt is going to assign him to Montgomery, Alabama. There, he is charged again with making sure that he's to protect land from trespassers, to guard against poachers. But even so many years later, he remains unwelcome in the South. In a private letter, he would write, "I was driven by persecution from Virginia into exile, and I am regarded in Alabama as an alien. If there had been any spirit of toleration among them, my home would be in Virginia now." So he still feels like he can't go back to Virginia. He's experiencing some of the same sentiments in Alabama. Unable to tolerate the situation anymore, in 1904, he asked his brother-in-law, Charles Russell, who's working in the DOJ, in the Department of Justice, to help him land a job. And in 1904, the 70-year-old finally returned east to Washington, D.C., where he would reside with his daughter Stuart and serve as an assistant attorney in the Department of Justice. But his stint there lasted only 6 short years. Just as he made his debut on the silent screen in October of 1910, the Justice Department dismissed him. Now, the government insisted that it was due to his age, but he was absolutely certain this was retaliation once more, this time for his efforts in indicting individuals from stealing from Native Americans in Alabama, in some of the land there. Whatever the reason, without a steady income, and having long lived close to the poverty line, he decided that he had no other choice but at the age of 70 to return to the lecture circuit. So again, he dons his signature broad-brimmed black felt hat, takes off across the country. He goes to New England, he goes to Canada, and this time he even starts to venture into the South, giving a talk to the UDC in Tennessee. Slowly, the old wounds were starting to heal, and his support for Grant began fading into the background of former Confederates' memory. And in 1915, the University of Virginia would confer a bronze medal upon him for his honor, and appreciation of, quote, the dignity and diligence which you have served your reunited country at home and abroad. And this time, the University of Virginia conveniently forgetting that they had kicked him out for attempted murder back in 1853. As a Baltimore paper reported, the gesture was sure to pave the way for reunion between Mosby and his fellow Virginians. But if he relished reconciliation, it was to be short-lived. In March of 1916, his health had declined to the point that he had to be admitted to a sanitarium in Norfolk. And 2 months later, the 82-year-old would pass away at a hospital in Washington, D.C. He never finished that memoir that he had been laboring for decades to write. Instead, it was his brother-in-law, Charles Wells Russell, who finished it and published it in 1917. Should point out that Russell was his brother-in-law twice over. He married one sister, and then when that sister passed away, he married another sister. So he knew a bit about the family. But it's interesting, when you read the memoir, if you pay close attention, you can start to see what is Russell and what is Mosby. Russell uses a lot of firsthand accounts. He uses a lot of letters and documents. You can see the parts that Russell wrote. But it's in the introduction that Russell would claim that Mosby had been dubbed, quote, one of the great heroes of the lost cause, and, quote, the blackest of redoubtable scoundrels by the North. But this picture painted by Russell stood at dark odds to Mosby's own experience in the war and the post-war era. The post-war life of John S. Mosby was without parallel among Confederate veterans. He rejected much of the lost cause ideology that would have elevated him to a place of fame, certainly within Virginia and even within the former Confederacy. Instead, he enthusiastically embraced a reconciliationist mindset, campaigning for Grant, campaigning for other Republicans, and fighting corruption until his dying day. That is, Mosby proved to be, till his very end, a rebel among rebels. Thank you.
For a more in-depth discussion with this speaker, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.